Good evening. Welcome to the panel discussion on Britain and the Western Baltic, hosted by the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. I want to thank Professor Brendan Sims and his staff at the Centre for Geopolitics for helping this to happen. It's the second in the Baltic programme series. Our first was in June on the 80th anniversary of the Soviet invasion of the Baltic states in 1940. I'm delighted to say we had a great deal of interest in this event, and we've now decided to have regular events to develop a Baltic programme, and we're building a Baltic geopolitics network of universities and scholars in the Baltic Sea region to look at the relationship between the Baltic countries around the Baltic Sea and Britain. We're working hard on this at the moment, and we intend to have a launch of it very early next year. This panel is an online video panel. We'll end at 7 o'clock promptly, and I will moderate a discussion with the panelists for the first half hour, and then in the second half, I'll relay questions from our audience to our panelists. You, as the audience, will be able to see and hear me and the panelists. You will have your microphone and camera switched off automatically, so at no time will you be heard or seen by anyone in this webinar. However, you are still able to communicate with me and the other panelists. At the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A option. Click on it, and when it opens, you have the chance to type questions. If you do type questions, please start by writing your name and your affiliation first. If your question is for a specific panelist, please make sure to state that at the outset as well. During our conversation, I'll try and cover as many of your questions as possible, though in view of the time constraints, we might not be able to address everybody's questions. Finally, I should let you know that this video panel is being recorded, and we will post the recording on our website over the next few days, so you can look at it later if you wish to do so or mention it to your friends. As I say, this panel is about Britain and the Western Baltic, by which I mean really the triangle bounded by Denmark, northern Germany, and southern Sweden. And Britain has developed its relationship with those countries and with that part of the world. And we're going to discuss this evening how that has developed, how it's worked, and what the impact is on the way we think about things currently on highly contemporary issues. We will intertwine through the conversation commerce and trade and the economic relations, ideological links, including religion, which was a big factor at some periods, and overall strategy and politics. We're very fortunate to have a first-class panel, and I'll just briefly introduce them now. The person who's going to speak first is Angela Huang, who's the head of the Research Center for Hanseatic and Baltic History in Luebeck in Germany. She studied history and philosophy in Nuremberg from 2002 to 2009 and did her master's in Hanseatic law in the late Middle Ages. Between 2010 and 2013, she did her PhD at the University of Copenhagen, working on the Hanseatic region and late medieval long-distance trade. Then she went to the London School of Economics, working on capital and grain markets in Central Europe, then back to Copenhagen in 2014, and a couple of years ago she took over the leadership of the Research Center for the History of the Hanseatic League in the Baltic Sea region in Luebeck. She's the author of numerous articles and publications on the history of the Hanseatic League. She will be able to guide us as to how this British relationship with that whole region evolved in the early period, and so you will be able to see the interlinking of our histories. The second speaker will be Henrik Breitenbauch, who's the head of the Center of Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen. He's a researcher and policy analyst with a track record of international and domestic agenda setting in defense and security, strategy processes, defense planning, as well as strategic foresight and future studies. His primary research focus is on strategy, including knowledge about the conditions for and characteristics of the use of armed force, including how political decisions are and ought to be taken, optimized and evaluated. He has a special interest in how policies developed and the strategic and security challenges facing Denmark, NATO, and the European Union. Our final panelist will be Nicola Classa, who's currently the Swedish ambassador to Finland. She served at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Sweden since 1991. Between 2006 and 2008, Nicola was the State Secretary to the Prime Minister, Fredrik Reinfeldt, with responsibility for foreign and EU affairs. She was the Swedish ambassador in London between 2010 and 2016, and since 2016, she's been the Foreign Ministry Coordinator for migration and refugee issues. Until a month or so ago, she moved to become the Swedish ambassador in Finland. She's also a broadcasting commentator. The BBC World Service asked her 3 or 4 years ago to do a program about the political game in the Eurovision Song Contest, and the program, called The Swedish Ambassador's Guide to Eurovision, got a lot of prizes. And then in 2018, followed up with The Swedish Ambassador's Guide to Britain, which focused in a very entertaining way on British identity. So she's a public commentator, not simply an analyst. So we're going to kick off with Angela talking about the origins of modern British engagement in the Western Baltic and the emergence of an English and British national interest in the Baltic and how that has all evolved. Each of our speakers are going to talk for about 10 minutes and then we'll open it to a wider conversation. So Angela Huang, welcome to this panel, and we very much look forward to what you're going to say.
Thank you very much. I just realized that in my life, I kind of covered the area that we are talking about today with the different places that I worked at. Funny coincidence. Yeah, I'm here to talk about the Hanseatic English history, or English Hanseatic, depending on your perspective. This is, of course, the rather large time span that we're talking about, English Hanseatic relationships beginning in the 12th century and lasting until the 17th century. And of course, German trade to England continued afterwards, obviously. I thought I should probably start by saying a few words on what the Hanseatic League actually is. I'm not quite sure if everybody is familiar with the phenomenon. It's a Northern European phenomenon in economic history. It's a union. First, it is a number of guilds of German merchants having trading posts in different areas around the Baltic, and of course also in the North Sea, for example, also in London, in Edinburgh, in other places in the North Sea, and of course in Novgorod, in Bruges, and in Scandinavia, of course in Denmark, in different places, and in Bergen in Norway. So this association first of merchants then evolves into an association of towns from the 14th century on. And that is when I think it gets particularly interesting, because this association of towns shapes, of course, market institutions, but also the political relationships between the areas that we're talking about. So at the basis of Hanseatic history are privileges, trade privileges that are acquired by merchants, and of course also then by their hometowns throughout time. And in England, this process starts in the 12th century with groups of merchants from the Baltic, but also from Cologne acquiring privileges. By the 13th century, they will hold privileges together, and that's when it starts to become Hanseatic history, because it is a Hanseatic community of merchants that holds privileges together. And these privileges are renewed for the last time in the 16th century, but are used until the late 17th century, actually. Afterwards, Hanseatic history based on special trading rights in England fades out slowly. I think it is and on the other side, of course, there is English involvement in the Baltic Sea area. That also starts in the 13th century, when German presence in England also starts. And I think it is important to note here that this is not a very, very good relationship over time. The English merchants try actually to establish themselves in the Baltic Sea area in competition to German merchants, and that is basically the dynamics that dominate English Hanseatic history. English merchants trying to be active, actually first not in the area that we are focusing on today, like the northern German parts, but mostly in Prussia and eastwards, also Livonia. And Now I lost my thread. Sorry, a lot of thoughts on the matter in my head. And Scottish merchants also were actually active in the Baltic Sea area already in the 13th century. But Scottish merchants and Scotland altogether are not that present in Hanseatic history. It's especially English merchants and the merchant adventurers here as a company that try to gain ground in the Baltic, which leads to numerous conflicts starting in the 1370s with the wars between actually the Hanseatic League and Denmark, which leads to certain rights the Hanseatic merchants hold in the Baltic, and actually they use those rights to exclude English merchants from the Baltic Sea area. And this is basically the first big event that leads to a number of conflicts between Hanse merchants, Hanse towns, and England, English merchants, and the English crown, lasting until the early 17th century. A few events throughout that period are quite well known. The Anglo-Hanziatic War in the 1470s, for example, and of course the expulsion of Hanse merchants from England and English merchants from the Holy Roman Empire at the end of the 16th century. So these are the low points of the relationship. But trade sources, other trade sources suggest that trade continues throughout all those conflicts. So on the one hand, we have ongoing conflict for centuries between English merchants and Hanseatic merchants, between the English crown and Hanse towns. And on the other hand, we have also mutual dependencies, of course. English merchants need Baltic goods, and they are then dependent on Hanseatic merchants bringing those goods. And on the other hand, of course, we have Hanse merchants being dependent on English cloth, which gains in popularity in the 14th century and the 15th century, and is basically the new leading textile good that is traded to Central Europe, but also to the Baltic Sea area. That would be a short characteristic of the relationship throughout time. I can, of course, talk a bit more about what are there any kind of special areas of interest that I should go a bit more into?
Angela, would you mind just talking about what you feel were the core nature of the commercial relationships you're describing? You mentioned textiles, and I know grain and naval stores were also important, but could you just talk a little more about the economic relationships that characterized these conflicts and issues?
Yes, of course. At the heart of it are really Baltic goods. And this is, of course, it is grain, yes, but Wendy Childs wrote an important article on the matter, which was titled Timber for Cloth. And that very nicely summarizes the relationship between the Baltic and England. Cloth, of course, is an important export, but the Hanseatic merchants delivering timber and iron also to England is very important for a comparatively industrialized area that is England. And of course, cloth is the most important good to be imported to Central Europe through Hanseatic towns downwards inland, which is, on the other hand, not really a Baltic not that much a Baltic part of Hanseatic trade, but it's more Cologne merchants trade that traded via Antwerp. So what is important in this relationship is that the Hanseatic merchants, or the German Hanse, basically the most important thing for Hanseatic history is dominating the Baltic Sea. This is very much the area that they compete for with other merchants, with English merchants, and also with Dutch merchants, of course. And this is very much about dominating the export of Baltic grain and Baltic timber from Prussia, but also then Russian goods, of course, furs and other luxury items.
So militarily, you mentioned the Anglo-Hanziatic War. How did this play out with the various powers around the Baltic Sea? Henrik, I think, is going to talk a little bit in a second about the Danish-Swedish component of that. But how do you see in your period of history the different strategic conflicts arising for the Hanseatic League and for the traders who were wanting to conduct their business at that time?
The English Hanseatic War actually starts as a war around the reciprocity of rights of English and Hanse merchants. So it's about taxation first, especially the taxations and the rights to trade amongst strangers in the different territories. So in the Baltic Sea area, of course, English merchants want to be able to trade freely with other foreigners and also with the local population. And the same is true for Hanse merchants in England, of course. So the war starts as a conflict about whether or not English merchants should be granted reciprocal rights. Of course, Hanse merchants claim that their privileges do not entail English having the same rights in the Baltic, and this is basically a point they do not really get over throughout centuries. But it actually escalates also in combination, of course, with other conflicts that the Hanseatic League fought with Denmark, of course. And I think what is most important or most interesting to see on a bit, if you zoom out a bit of the English Hanseatic relationships, it's interesting that being successful in this conflict is due to the ongoing conflicts of England with France and with the other part of the continent in the North Sea. So to relieve pressure on that part, they are then happy to, or not happy to, I wouldn't say, but they see themselves forced to negotiate a peace with the Hanseatic merchants. So Hanseatic merchants very much play on international conflicts to actually decide conflicts with England for themselves.
Thank you. And two more very quick points. One, in terms of the ideological, the religious conflicts of the period that were very dominant in many relationships, could you just comment a little bit on the ideological aspects of the Hanseatic League and its relationship? You mentioned earlier the Holy Roman Empire, and of course trading was very much dependent on the religious belief systems of the various states in which people were able to operate. Could you add anything on that dimension?
It is actually interesting that the Hanseatic League, when we study the history of the Hanseatic League, religion is not that important. Of course, the Reformation and the 30 Years' War impact trade, especially the 30 Years' War as a large-scale war that basically prevents trade between Hanseatic towns and England. And also, basically, has a very negative impact on the Hanseatic League as an association altogether. But in the trade relations between the Hanseatic merchants and the English, and even between Hanse towns having different religions, this is not very dominant. We can see that this is a very pragmatic association that we find here of merchants of different religions, different confessions, but that still have the common interest, the common commercial interests that seem to overrule the conflicts that they have.
Thank you. And my final question before we move to Henrik is, in the minds of the governing forces in England and Scotland at this time, was it the case that the Baltic was at the top of their agenda? France probably would have been number one in many ways, but how would you characterize the interest of the English kings and queens and the Scottish kings and queens and their various ruling circles? How important was the Baltic to them, and how important was this Hanseatic trade to them?
I wouldn't say that it was the most important area of English trade. I mean, there's, of course, Antwerp, the Low Countries that are, especially important since the 15th century when London becomes such an important port for England, for English trade. But before the 15th century, when other, like along the eastern coast of England, other ports were much more important in comparison to London, the Baltic was quite important. And as I said, I think the Baltic was quite important also because of the goods that English, were imported to England only from there. timber, like for timber, the Baltic was the most important source. For building ships, basically, relationships with the Baltic were crucial. And of course, grain transports, I mean, it's the same for the Netherlands, of course. That was quite dependent. They grew quite dependent on Baltic grain, and for England, it is not quite the same. But grain imports are also quite important here.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Angela. I think that gives us a great context to start our conversation. I introduced Henrik earlier, and he is based in Copenhagen, as I said, at the center, the head of the Center for Military Studies. And Henrik, can I ask you to take us a bit forward in time and perhaps to the various great power conflicts that the Baltic was at the center of? So to Henrik Breitenbauch.
Yes, Charles. Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. The conclusion of my remarks, where I would like to go with what I'll be saying in a few minutes, is basically that the Baltic Sea area, in my mind, has to be understood as the greater Nordic space boxed in between three great powers: the UK, Russia, and Germany to the south, and to the north there's just ice. It's the Arctic area, and explains the interest in the Arctic domain by all the Nordic countries. But that box is a geopolitical buffer zone, and it has no security policy inertia or weight in its own. It's completely dependent on outside greater powers. And that box, the greater Nordic space, has basically been existing since the mid 18th century, and is, as far as I can see, what we mean when we speak of the geopolitics of the Baltic Sea region. Now, how does this come about? Well, I'm not, as Angela, a historian. I'm a political scientist, so I'm invariably wrong about the details. But I like to focus on the big traits. And in this case, the way I look at geopolitics is from a perspective that is a combination of Fernand Braudel, the historian of the Mediterranean, looking at the longue durée, the very long periods of time, and then Charles Tilley's interest in the accrual of political capital, military means, and the ability to tax, and then the emergence of the modern state. And so from that, basically, you can see that this is sort of a French geopolitical perspective, that where you have a space in which there are interactions among certain people, they trade, and then they agglomerate in polities. And at a certain point in history in the Baltic Sea area, you have the emergence of the Hanseatic Trading League. But the modern states emerged, and they were better at accruing power and capital than the Hanseatic League. It could not compete with them in political or military terms. And so in the end, the modern states won out. And near the end of the period that Angela introduced us to, what you see emerging in before what emerges as the modern geopolitics of the greater Nordic space is a competition for hegemony in the area between Denmark and Sweden. And Denmark and Sweden fought many, many wars over the years, just very much like the UK and France. And in the end, the Swedes won out and temporarily held a relatively dominant position in the greater Nordic space. But as part of this competition for hegemony in the 17th and 18th century, basically what happened was that outside powers found that they could not allow one power to dominate the greater Nordic space. And so they started intervening in order to secure a balance of power inside the space. They started also with the Dutch, but the Brits were also very good at intervening, partially for reasons of avoiding hegemony, but also for reasons of avoiding balances of power that went outside of the greater Nordic space. So, for example, when the Brits intervened in 1801 and 1807 in Copenhagen, and finally left with what was left of the Danish Navy, and hence the very last aspirations to at least a middle power status for the Kingdom of Denmark in 1807, that was also a symbolic mark where the Brits intervened in order for in order to avoid that Denmark sided with the Russians. And for that reason, ever since the end of the Danish-Swedish rivalry, you have basically seen the Nordic, the greater Nordic space as a space that is not something unto itself in geopolitical terms, but is rather determined by outside global and regional power relations that are bigger than the Nordic countries themselves. So basically, since I would say about 1750, the geopolitics of the Baltic Sea area has been defined by these outside powers to a varying degree. And of course, we can struggle over the exact meaning of this because Germany only emerges as a unified power much later in the period. But you certainly can see how Germany pushes up with the two wars with Denmark in 1848, the War of the Duchies, and the second one in 1864, where Germany pushes all the way up to the middle of Jutland by conquering both Schleswig and Holstein. So the greater Nordic space in this way is also a practical metaphor for enabling us to understand the particular kind of politics that then emerges after the two great wars, because the Nordic countries during the 19th century develop a certain kind of politics where they, because they're no longer allowed the military means to fight for themselves and to become European states with a fully fledged colonial external policy, they develop a politics of smallness and peacefulness, which is perhaps also predecessors to the later Nordic welfare states, but which at least in terms of foreign policy means that they very often focus on neutrality, and they work hard on developing the international the predecessor to the League of Nations, for example, the Interparliamentary Union is a creation of a Danish parliamentarian supported by goodwill from Sweden and Norway and other European countries, of course. But the Nordics had a strong role in the late 19th century in propagating a sort of a liberal, peaceful approach to world politics, probably exactly because they had been denied the means to actually exert power politics. And so Denmark being neutral, for example, during World War I, Sweden during World War II, Denmark was invaded, so was Norway. And again, in both cases, we can see that even if in World War I, the Nordic countries were spared the evils of most of the evils of the World War, notwithstanding the many Danes who fought on the German side because they were forced to as conscript in the Kaiser's army. The Second World War very clearly showed the Nordic countries that they are not able to defend themselves, neither to defend themselves nor to in any meaningful way stick together and avoid the bad weathers of the international political system. So for that reason, also after World War II, you have the final sort of solidification of the Nordic model, which is partially a huge investment in liberal international institutions such as the United Nations, in development aid, and in peace building, and so on. But on the other hand, also, at least for Denmark and Norway's case, a deeply vetted commitment to NATO and to the institutional arrangements of that kind of joint security. But during the Cold War, and this is what I'll end up, during the Cold War, you could very clearly see that the distinctions between the institutional affiliations between Denmark and Norway on one side as NATO countries and Sweden and Finland as unaffiliated countries on the other clearly showed how the greater Nordic space still in this era was a geopolitical buffer zone where no single outside power, now in this case the Soviet Union and the United States, held the absolute upper hand. And in many ways, the Finlandization of Finland, on the one hand, a very strong-willed resistance to outside influence from the Soviet Union, also, but coupled with an understanding and an ability to sort of pliably receive the pressure from the Soviets, underscores the buffer zone mentality which follows from being inside this box between the greater outside powers. So the paradox to my mind at least, of the Baltic Sea area is that it historically over time isn't really a region. because it cannot stand on its own 2 feet. It's dependent on and subject to the wills of outside powers, notably, especially of course, also the influence of the UK, including in more recent times through the more benevolent politics, as opposed to some of the more problematic politics coming from, for example, still from Russia today. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Henrik, thank you very much. There are a number of interesting points which emerge from what you've just been saying. Firstly, could you talk just a little bit about the economic relationships? Obviously, when we were discussing the Hanseatic history, which is obviously well before the period you're talking about, the economic relationships were extremely important. But if you look at some of the events in the 18th and 19th century, for example, you mentioned the attacks on Copenhagen, or for example, the intervention with the Baltic fleet against Russia at the time of the Crimean War in the 1850s. These feel like they're strategic and political interventions, not economic interventions. But is that right? Is there in fact an economic set of relationships which needs to be included in the discussion which you've just given us?
Well, I certainly think that the economic relationships are central to and an important component of all of the political and geopolitical logics of each of the eras. So I think from sort of the end of the era of the Hanseatic dominance and the emergence of the modern nation states, the evolution of large warships and the evolution of large ocean-going naval vessels also meant an increase in the need on a European scale for timber for ships, and that increased the importance of trade patterns in the Baltic Sea region. And of course, I think the role of the UK Navy in the growth and sustainment of the British Empire over the decades until the emergence of metal hulls was an important element in the British interest in having access to these kinds of trade areas. And so for that reason also, the Danish control over the straits and Copenhagen's ability to extract much taxation from the trade in the area was also a security political concern for the Brits. I'm not familiar exactly with the very specific historical details, but as far as I remember, the role of external powers, for example, in deciding the Danish-Swedish wars, where the formerly Danish side of what is now Sweden on the other side of the sound outside of Copenhagen, the fact that those lands fell into Swedish hands, so to speak, finally was also an attempt by outside powers to break up the monopoly on the trade of the sounds. So the patterns of trade and money in that way plays an incredibly important role, especially in these earlier founding periods. I think later on, when we come into the 20th century, it probably matters a little less, especially because of the establishment of a railway system, and earlier on also in the 19th century of a system of canals in Europe through which a lot of the trade moved. So in a sense, the emergence of iron hulls, metal hulls, and as well as canals and the railway system meant that the strategic significance of the Baltic Sea as a trading network was eroded.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Henrik. We'll now move to the final phase, the more recent period, where I'm going to ask Nicola Classa to make a presentation. As I said, Nicola is currently the Swedish ambassador to Finland, but has a wide degree of experience. I wondered, Nicola, what you thought of Henrik's description of the Baltic geopolitical buffer zone, which the Baltic Sea is, and how relevant that is to the period since 1945.
No, I think it's he's making a number of very important points there. And I want to start with, first of all, thanking you for having me on this panel. And I think what we can conclude after two excellent interventions is that the Baltic Sea is undoubtedly one of the world's most dynamic and diverse regions with a fascinating history, but also that it has not always been peaceful. And I would then add that there is one exception, the relationship between Sweden and Britain, or England as it was in the far back in history. And if we go back as far as 1654, that's when Queen Christina of Sweden and Oliver Cromwell of England agreed a friendship pact, which to my knowledge has actually never been broken. And there was a minor hiccup in 1810 when during the Napoleonic Wars, where Sweden declared war on Britain, which fortunately Britain did not take seriously. And it was thanks to Admiral Saumarez, originating from Guernsey, who realized that if we wait them out, then everything will be all right. And we were so grateful that in the end, he was bestowed with a medal by King Charles XIII. So there you go. But for those of us living on the shores of the Baltic Sea, I mean, its immense importance is self-evident because it's practically a lifeline due to the shipping routes that connect our countries to the global system of commerce. And it's interesting to note that about 15% of the world's cargo traffic is handled on the Baltic Sea, which means that it's one of the busiest maritime places on Earth. And talking about Denmark and Sweden, it's also interesting now that for 20 years now, the Öresundsbridge, the bridge, has been connected Denmark and Sweden, but also road and rail networks from the Scandinavian peninsula to other parts of, well, to continental Europe. Now, British interest in the Baltic region has, as has been pointed out, primarily been about trade and security, and those are obviously interlinked. So upholding the freedom of access to the Baltic Sea has been seen as of vital importance and continues to be. Now, it's a bit hard to sum up the British role in the Baltic region in the last 75 years in just a few minutes, but I thought that I would focus on a few specific and significant events where Britain did play a major role, and the impact of world events in 1948 to 49 can then provide a starting point. Obviously, the UK policy toward the Baltic region during the Cold War was very much built on the containment of the Soviet Union. And the Prague coup in 1948 heightened Western fears of the threat of communist expansion. And this was a time when both Britain and the US wanted to draw the three Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, into the NATO alliance. And from the very start, the then, I should point out, no longer, but then neutral Sweden opposed demands for this participation in this military collaboration. And as an alternative, Sweden proposed to Denmark and Norway the establishment of a Scandinavian defense union, and Britain was very much opposed to this idea. Why? Well, the British feared that a Scandinavian defense alliance would come under pressure from Russia to close the Öresund Strait from vessels from the West. And of course, that would have had a very negative impact on British trade and security. And the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Ernest Bevin, he was very critical, openly critical towards this proposal. And the US was also quite skeptical, as the Americans wanted privileged access to strategic air and sea bases in the Baltic Sea region. So the plans for a Scandinavian Defense Alliance failed in January 1949, and Denmark and Norway subsequently joined NATO. Sweden did not. Now, although this defense union came to nothing, the years after the Second World War were marked by numerous Nordic activities. The Nordic Council was founded in 1952. A Nordic passport union was created that same year. And with trade being at the forefront, Britain and Sweden worked closely together to set up the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, in 1959. And the British government saw that EFTA could serve as a halfway house to the European common market. And already the following year, that Britain, a bit perhaps unexpectedly, attempted to revise its European policy and win membership in the EEC. And de Gaulle's refusal then to accept the British gave both EFTA and Sweden additional breathing space. And then in 1967, Britain reapplied and was turned down again. And the Danes then proposed a customs union, Nordic, to be negotiated under the auspices of the Nordic Council. The idea was to provide a dynamic framework from the growth of all the Nordic economies, but it failed because Finland withdrew, and then Sweden did not want to act in a way that could isolate Finland, potentially. Now, the Danes were the most eager among the Scandinavians to join the common market in the hope that it would secure access for their farm products, not least bacon, to both West German and the British market. And then in 1973, the UK and Denmark and Ireland became members of the EEC, and it would take nearly 2 decades for Sweden to join. Interestingly, despite the European Economic Area, it was a single market that threatened to undermine Sweden's traditional relationship with the European Union and indeed Britain. So that was a big factor in Sweden joining the EU in 1995. So the end of the Cold War changed the European scene, and there was hope that an era of confrontation and division was finally over. And as a response to the geopolitical changes that now took place in the Baltic Sea region, the Council of Baltic Sea States was established in 1998 with Russia as one of its members. And in 1999, the UK joined as an observer. A decade later, the EU Baltic Sea strategy was launched. But if we then fast forward to the present time, unfortunately, the military strategic situation in the Baltic region has deteriorated in recent years, and it's clear that the significance of the Baltic region to European security has increased. NATO now sees the Baltic Sea region as one strategic military area, and the UK role within NATO is critical. So in times of increased tension with Russia, both NATO and the EU play key roles and can act in a mutually reinforcing way. I'll stop there, and then I also want to take the opportunity to thank you for organizing this event, and that you commend you for the interest in the Baltic Sea region. Great.
Nicola, thank you very, very much indeed. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions, if I can, on what you're feeling. But just to remind the audience, the participants, please feel free to put in questions. We should have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions, so please feel free to put in questions. I've got a couple which I've received already, but I'd welcome them. But what I wanted to ask you, Nicola, is what do you think the impact of Brexit is upon this process? Or to put it slightly the other way around, the post-1945 settlements, which led to the neutrality of Sweden, to NATO membership for other countries and so on, all that period has come to an end in a sense. Will there be a re-evaluation of these relationships that the individual Baltic countries have? And what will be the impact of Brexit upon the thinking of the Baltic countries in those circumstances, do you think?
Well, first I have to, on the point of neutrality, the Swedish neutrality came much earlier. It was already sort of during the, basically in 1814, and we can always discuss exactly how that sort of worked during the 19th century, but that's an important point to make. And then it ended in 2002, and that I know because part of the negotiations that, and it's an important point to make, and that's why I stressed it before. But obviously, I don't think it's, I mean, with Brexit, it will have an impact. I don't think we can yet know everything that will sort of be, all the consequences. I think that will play out, and it also depends on how this this last round, if we do get a deal or not. I mean, obviously we're hoping that things will work out, but it is very problematic, and I think I mean, when you look at the European Union, Britain was arguably the EU's strongest defense power, so obviously that's also an important point to make. But I think we have to move in a direction where we try to figure out how we can how we can manage this relationship in a way that it's conducive to the situation that we're now facing in the Baltic Sea region. And I hope, and I think that's what we will see, that interest from the UK side will remain. And then, of course, because the trade and security interest will remain. So I think there's, I'm optimistic in that sense, but very sad about Brexit. But I think that that is something that's shared by many other Europeans.
It certainly is, and the boat has sailed. Henrik, do you have any thoughts on the same question about how you think Brexit will operate and how you think the different Baltic states will redefine their relationships with both NATO and the European Union in the light of this evolving situation?
Yes. From a Danish perspective, Brexit has been traumatic because we entered the European Union or the European Economic Communities together with the UK, and so the UK leaving was not just a kind of a strategic disaster at the level of no longer having a big partner being able to say things that we strongly believe in, like more classic free trade policies as opposed to the continental European positions and so on. So, but it also felt a little bit like being left by a girlfriend. So there was a certain amount of emotional trauma in the politics. But I think that shock has kind of receded now, and there's a clearer understanding in Copenhagen. I think that's also generally true that if the UK is clearly losing out in terms of agenda setting power in all of the regular politics areas that are those where the European Union is the strongest, then the strategic significance of the UK is not diminished. And so in a sense, in the Baltic Sea region, the significance of a strong UK position in terms of security politics and military defense policy is in many ways exacerbated by Brexit. So it's not just driven by 2014 and Putin in the UK and so on. It's also a way for the UK to compensate some of the weaknesses that arrive in the other policy domains. So my area of specialization, defense and security policy, is an area where the UK's position is naturally exacerbated in these years because of its diminished influence in other areas. And so I think it's one of those moments where it's important also to recall that Europe is bigger than the EU, and there's a community of states that meets and discusses things classic traditionally. So we can also see this in security politics. For example, the big 3 European countries in the Iran negotiations. So we recognize, I think everyone recognizes that there is a position already for the UK even outside of the EU. But also that this especially will play itself out in terms of defense and security policy. And there, the events of 2014, in a sense, come in handy because they enable and require a bigger role for the UK as part of the sort of the ongoing dialogues among the smaller countries in the region. And since 2010, the UK has actually, with great foresight, I think it was launched by the FCO, but it could also be the MOD. The UK has launched a consultation forum, which is called the Northern Group, and which consists in a number of Baltic Rim riparian states, and then the UK. Probably the Dutch are also there because of the Hanseatic legacy. But that forum is a reminder for us that the UK already before Brexit and well before events of 2014 was re-engaging with the Baltic Sea region as a place where the UK has the strongest and most significant power in military and strategic terms ought to have a role as an organizer of diplomatic dialogue.
That's true, and David Cameron's government with William Hague as Foreign Secretary in 2010 took a big initiative in encouraging this. Angela, I know this is hundreds of years beyond what you were talking about earlier on, but do you have any observations you'd like to make on these questions?
Well, one observation I have, which is that I find it quite interesting that in times of the developments that were just described by Nicola and Henrik, there is a new Hanseatic League, which again brings together now states that want to protect their common interests around the Baltic Sea area, and of course, yeah, like around their common economic interests. So, yeah, hundreds of years after there was a voluntary association of towns and merchants protecting their mutual interests, this is picked up again. And this is also, this is not, I think, of course, it is not quite the same as the historic Hanseatic League, but it's interesting to see that at the moment, in a time in difference to the Middle Ages, where there were no strong states or very few emerging states, and now we have a time with very strong states that try to become even stronger by forming a unity, a common market. And then we have a similar development of a voluntary association of economically like-minded partners in the Baltic Sea area. I find that a very interesting development.
I think it was founded in 2018, wasn't it? The new
Yes.
League, quite recently. There was one other.
And it does not really. There are no actual Hanseatic towns. I think not a lot of former Hanseatic areas are included actually, because that would be Germany, and Germany is not part of it. But Finland and Sweden, of course, and of course the Baltic states.
Well, when I was a member of Parliament, it was for the city of Norwich in England, which was a Hanseatic town, as was Yarmouth a long, long time ago. Now, I thought there's one other question that's come directly to me that I thought I'd just put in. You commented on the way in which the Baltic was at the behest of other great powers acting and dealing with it. And there are two that strike me very forcibly. One is Russia and the other is China into the future, how these great powers will operate in relation to the Baltic Sea. So perhaps I could just ask you firstly, how you see Russian politics and strategy emerging vis-a-vis the Baltic Sea. And perhaps, Nicola, I could start with you to see if you've got any observations on that. I know it's difficult to read the signals from Russia currently very clearly, but will this geopolitical buffer zone characteristic, which has been discussed, how does that play in relation to Russia?
I think that we then need to actually extend, when we look at the Baltic Sea region, we also have to think about the Arctic. I think it's also sort of now, in a way, increasingly the case that we have to look at it as that it's sort of becoming more and more linked. I think the whole thing with shipping is going to take a very interesting turn if we see developments in the Arctic that we're already seeing with the climate change, that we will see shipping taking that route. So a lot will be happening in the region. But going back to specifically Russia, I mean, I think unfortunately what we've seen, and of course with the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and what's going on in eastern Ukraine, it's been a very, very unfortunate development, and also that tension in the Baltic Sea area has increased. So what one could wish for is the things could sort of calm down a bit, but at the moment that is not really the case. Well, we have to try to work with the dialogue and so on, and try to improve the situation. So that's problematic, and it's sad, and that's why when I was saying with the Council of Baltic Sea States, which was something that was actually initiated by the Danes and the Germans, and there with the Russians. But those were the days when we thought that we could do many things, and there was sort of a hope about a peaceful coexistence. But right now it's a bit problematic.
Thank you. Henrik, any observations on the same question about Russia and the Baltic?
Yes, I think, and I'd like to go back to Angela's point before of kind of the renewed interest in and then salience of ideas of networks of trading cities and sort of lower level contacts, because as Nicola mentioned, in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War, the Baltic Sea Council and other kinds of sort of low politics initiatives were the ones that were emphasized in order to sort of reap the benefits of the newfound peace and peaceful relationships with the former Soviet Union. And in some ways, we kind of see that these two kinds of politics are still operating at the same time. On the one hand, we have the strict military logic of the new confrontational stance and the necessity for NATO to be able to defend itself, to deter and defend itself in the specific Baltic countries, all the way over near the border of Russia. And then on the other hand, you still have an ongoing, as opposed to the Cold War, you still have an ongoing and very elaborate set of trading partnerships going on. And so I think in terms of, and we published a report on this from my center very recently, which looked at opportunities for kind of investing in better dialogue with the Russians. And we also identified some of these lower level, low politics areas as a way of going about this. And so in the future, you can imagine even more networks of cities at even lower levels to have these kinds of emphasis on trade and cultural exchanges, and really a renewed attempt to work with that heritage of the immediate post-Cold War years of the low politics, while you at the same time have this intense military competition going on. And just a footnote on that, because it used to be that the Baltic Sea area was kind of a small theater apart. It was adjacent to the big imagined World War III theater in northern Germany that NATO was expecting. But post INF, after the end of the INF treaty, we see now the emergence of many types of missiles with much longer range and faster speeds, which means that militarily the Baltic Sea region is no longer a theater apart. As Nicola said, even the Arctic is becoming part of the wider European theater from a military strategic sense. So there's even less reason, except for the naval dimension, to see the Baltic Sea area as a specific military problem. Wasn't it for the fact that NATO needs to be able to defend itself in the Baltic countries? But that has ramifications far beyond the Baltic Sea area, and in that way, it might mean that this kind of double existence of a hard military confrontation and then continued trade patterns, that might mean that there is actually a space for initiatives akin to the one that Angela mentioned, that there is a potential for further dialogue and cooperation, but at very low levels.
Thank you. We've almost run out of time, so I'm going to give each of you the opportunity to have any general reflections. But I will read a question which has come from one of our colleagues, Faik Habash, who's doing an MA at the University of Tartu in Estonia and Glasgow universities. By the way, both of those will be universities that are part of our Baltic geopolitical network. And so we're delighted, Faik, that you've joined us. His question is to Henrik, but I think I'll ask all of you, on the issue of the rise of nation states. It's widely understood, he says, that ideal type nation states, France and England before Germany, rose to prominence on the expense of city leagues like the Hansa. With Brexit and with the rise of right-wing nationalism, specifically the revival of irredentist movements, would you say there's any drive to co-opt the Hanseatic legacy to push for changing borders in the Baltic Sea, changing borders, specifically looking at Russian island hopping or the change of status of the Åland Islands? That's one to test you. But I'll ask that general question to all three of you, but ask you to add to your answer any general remarks you'd like to make about all this before I close the whole event. So I'll go Nicola, Angela, then Henrik. Nicola, first of all.
I think the question that you just asked there, the answer would be no, and a firm no. I would add. But one thing that I would like to say, actually, I noticed that none of us has actually said COVID-19 during the whole session, which is very unusual nowadays when you meet. But one should be reminded that when we talk about the Baltic Sea now, I mean, during this pandemic, it used to be that every day you had about 2,000 ships on the Baltic Sea, but it's very tragic what we're seeing, and it's economically it's a bit of a disaster. I'm just looking at the port in Helsinki, for example. It's down at least 50%, but that's what we're seeing throughout the whole region. So all the sort of all the things that we've been talking about right now, it's a difficult situation. So we should be reminded about that what's actually going on at the moment.
Thank you very much. Angela, do you have any answers to the question or general comments upon the thoughts on the conversation we've been having?
Thank you. A very interesting question. I think it very nicely ties in what we have been discussing before with the new Hanseatic League. But I think another level, of course, is I do not think that that maybe a new activity of towns or from below, so to speak, as Henrik also put it, like a more informal, maybe commercial activity to bring together the Baltic countries. I do not think that this will be a shift in borders or anything alike. But what I think is quite interesting to see is that, for example, there are several initiatives, also urban initiatives, to revive urban networks. And of course, they have to, of course, they are below the state level and they have not the autonomy to do what the Hanseatic League did centuries ago. But I think there is an interesting trend in looking again at how towns can actually, because towns are now holding so much of the world's population and also of Baltic communities, and are also hubs that want to connect via ports, via ships, via tourism. And I think this is an interesting development that we should have a look at in the future. I think there are more and more associations of towns actually popping up in the last decades, and it will be interesting to see how they position themselves in relation to the nation states, especially in the Baltic Sea area.
Thank you very much, Angela. And Henrik, yours is the last word in answering the particular question, but also any general remarks.
No changes of border, and I think that is because states are still important. So even if there can be cooperation at both formal and informal levels in terms of trade and civil society at lower levels and between the cities and so on, which is a wonderful thing for integration and peaceful dialogue, the states are still primordial. And I think the emergence of the modern states and the fact that no state did get to dominate the Baltic Sea area, and which instead is a geopolitical buffer zone where outside state powers in the end largely determine the play of events. That to me is the most important takeaway of the discussion today.
Well, thank you very much, Henrik, and thank you to all three of our panelists. We're now at the end of this panel. I think it's been a very interesting and provocative discussion. And I think it's the lessons from the past for the future are extremely interesting to reflect on. I do want to remind you that you can soon be able to find a recording of the event on the Centre of Geopolitics website, www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk. And I want to thank, first of all, the panelists. Thank you for your very, very positive contributions. Secondly, all the participants. I hope you found it interesting and worthwhile. And as I say, we'll be having a continuing series of events of this kind, which we will provide information on the website as we develop our Baltic program and as we develop our network of the Baltic geopolitical universities. And we're looking forward to that. And so thank you for coming. And thank you also finally to the organizers of this event, to the people from the Centre for Geopolitics, Professor Brendan Sims and his colleagues. Thank you all very much. Good evening.